wage in the country. What is the really situation of things right now, apart from the demands coming from the organized labor, and even in some states they have already set up such committees to review minimum wage pertaining to that state. So let's look at it at the national level. The federal government did set up a committee to review the minimum wage, and allegations against the committee also.
Yes, quite a lot of allegations are coming because, you know, already there are about 6 governors on the committee, and coincidentally, none of the governors that is on that committee appears to be paying the minimum wage right now. That was coming by the NLC president himself. When the president decided to set up the committee on the 31st of January 2024, the committee consists of the representatives of the Nigerian Labour Congress, the chairman, and then the chairman of the Trade Union Congress, representative from the Ministry of Labour, the representatives from the 6 geopolitical zones, and so many other critical stakeholders were drawn to form part of the committee. And the committee was saddled with the responsibility of making calculations in view of the current realities to ensure that the minimum wage is actually a take-home pay that an average worker can actually take home and fend for himself and the family for the next payday. And that committee had already started working, and until about 6 days ago, again, when the issue of remuneration for the committee came up, Mr. President, out of his wisdom, had approved the release of 500 million naira to serve as allowances and expenses for the committee. But the committee also had a different idea, and they came up with a budget of 1.8 billion naira, and which was slashed down to about 1 billion naira. Now you can see that the 35-man committee is expected to sit down and recalculate the minimum wage to ensure that workers especially are able to take home their monthly salary in view of the current realities. The current realities, of course, entails that all the inflation that have come to overshadow the current minimum wage has to be taken into cognizance to ensure that at every point in time the worker is not shortchanged on the long run. The NLC president initially had thought that 200,000 naira will be the next benchmark of minimum wage. But you know, he also shifted the goalpost when he came out to say that in view of the current realities of the crash of the naira against the dollar and the skyrocketing nature of prices of commodities and services, the minimum wage could be shifted to about 1 million naira to actually meet up the daily demands of the Nigerian worker. So by and large, you realize that this is the situation we're in now. The committee is already sitting down, and usually salaries are always reviewed once in every 10 years, because it is assumed that after every 10 years there's the need to look at the level of inflation and whether the salary package is enough to cater for the average worker in view of the current realities. So the last minimum wage of 30,000 naira had just expired.
Which many people are yet to benefit from.
Yes,
it. Even at the federal level.
Even at the federal level, yes.
Not so talk about state.
It has just expired, and hence the need for the review of the next minimum wage. In most senior climes, minimum wage could be reviewed either upward or downward. Even though in Nigeria we are more used to reviewing upward because prices of commodities never come down. But in more developed nations, if not of recent, where we have global meltdown and also the world going into economic recess, when you go to some countries, they review their minimum wage downward because of the falling nature of prices of commodities and services. Hence, the minimum wage have to be reduced. But in third world nations like Nigeria and in many capitalist nations where they also are suffering from this economic meltdown as well as inflation, the review of minimum wage has always been an upward surge. So I believe that when the federal government, the Nigerian Labour Congress, and the TUC, as well as all other critical stakeholders that make up the 37-member committee, have concluded their sittings, we expect to see a much more reasonable minimum wage that is enough to take home.
Okay, if eventually they reach a common front, either 200,000 naira or even 1 million naira as minimum wage by the federal government, how feasible is it that the state might domesticate it? Reports has it that some states have already set up their own minimum wage review committee.
Well, minimum wage is always binding on all. The review of minimum wage and conclusion on what should be the national minimum wage is not an issue of states deciding what to pay. Once the national minimum wage is concluded, it is binding on all states, and every sitting governor have to abide by the conclusion or by the recommendation that has been approved.
Minimum wage then wasn't implemented in most states.
Yes, it wasn't implemented, but again, you know, the Nigerian Labour Congress of those states have rose against that, even though for some states the NLC had largely been silent. This is owing to the fact that probably the leadership there is not so active, or the leadership may have been on the side of the government and may not want to jeopardize the activities of governance in the state, and hence decide to mellow down and allow sleeping dog to lie. But in some other states where they have active NLC membership or executive, they've rose against that, and many states were able to achieve their aim. Some were able to achieve partly, like in Niger State, for example. To some extent, I think the NLC have done a very good job, right from the time of the current Deputy Governor, Comrade Yakubu Garba, when he was the NLC chairman. We saw how he had moved from pillar to post and have been very active to ensure that the Niger State government then paid the minimum wage. And to some extent, they've been able to increase the salaries of workers, even though it is a matter of calculations to note that whether what is being paid is actually the minimum wage or not. But you realize that to some extent the NLC under his leadership had done very well that time to ensure that workers were able to get an increase in salaries, even though that may not have been achieved. But again, if in an effort to reach the sky, you end up on the mountaintop, you may have improved your lots over those who are still at the sea level. So in Niger State, we cannot say we are still at the sea level, but somewhere on the mountaintop, and we'll still be getting up and up until we reach the sky.
Allegations against the minimum wage committee, have we really anticipated that such might arise?
I didn't get
allegations against the minimum wage committee set up by the federal government, saying that, okay, since instead of them to focus on improving the minimum wage of the workers, they are talking about their own sitting allowance or what have you.
Yes, you know, like I said, it is a high-powered committee made up of sitting governors. And when you have such kind of committee with the governors and their positions as critical stakeholders in the country, of course, you know, the allowances or funding of the activities of the committee will have to be a little bit higher. And 6 sitting governors are involved, and including a minister, as well as the chairman of the Nigerian Labour Congress and that of the Trade Union Congress. So it's a high-powered committee, including some other members too, critical stakeholders. And of course, if they demand for their sitting allowance, I think it is what rightly belongs to them. And for quite a number of people, they assume that it is just going to be just sitting and then deliberating and then going up and down. You know, a sitting governor who will have to leave his duty post as a governor of a state to go and sit for that committee will have to spend upward of like 2-3 days at a sitting, and then they go on recess and then come back again and then continue with the sittings. So I believe that they also need a serene environment where they could sit without much disturbance. And by and large, I believe that if you are a sitting governor, you don't expect a sitting governor to take an allowance, sitting allowance of maybe 100,000 naira or so, because even a minister won't take 100,000 naira as a sitting allowance. So definitely it will come in millions, looking at their positions, those of the ministers and then those of other members of the committee. So I believe it is not the money that people should be concerned about, but the deliberations and the conclusions that they are likely going to reach. Usually when you are preparing a minimum wage, you look at the rate of inflation and then you look at the GDP of a country. You put a minimum wage that is sustainable. If you have a minimum wage that is sustainable, it means that the government will be able to pay that minimum wage continuously for the next 10 years until when the review of another minimum wage will take place. So if...
Despite the position of the currency in that
Despite
country,
the position of the currency, it has to be what you are having as revenue and then the inflation rate. If what you are having as a revenue cannot sustain the minimum wage, then it's useless to peg the minimum wage at that rate, because you start paying and then somewhere along the line you don't pay again. That will be a problem. I can still recall sometimes in 1999 when General Abdulsalami Abubakar reviewed the minimum wage, and there was more than nearly 800% increase in the salaries of workers. For a worker who was receiving 1,600 naira then, suddenly was receiving 11,000 plus. You know, there was an increase of about 10,000 naira then, and 10,000 naira was real money, because if you are to juxtapose 10,000 naira of 1999 with its value now, it will be almost around like 300,000 to 500,000 naira. So when he paid that salary for about 2, 3, 4 months and realized that the country cannot sustain that salary, it has to be reviewed downward for what is realistic. So it's the same thing. The committee will have to sit down, look at the GDP of the country, look at the inflation rate, and then look at even the competing demands, such as payment of debts that the country has incurred in the last few years, and then before pegging the minimum wage. It will be useless if a minimum wage is pegged at 100,000 naira, for example, and the government is not able to sustain that. You can see the government talk about paying palliative of 35,000 naira to workers starting from October, I think. After paying for just 1 month, it couldn't pay again. So, I mean, the minimum wage committee will have to be very careful to come up with a figure that is sustainable, a figure that the federal government can pay continuously without much problem. So if the NLC chairman, for example, is saying they are going to peg the minimum wage to about 1 million naira, of course, you know, it's unrealistic. We have to be candid to ourselves. The Nigerian government cannot pay minimum wage of 1 million naira monthly to the person who is collecting the smallest salary in the country. It's unrealistic and it's unsustainable. So sustainability of a minimum wage is what we are talking about here. And there is the need for the committee to actually come up with a voice. Because if the NLC chairman is already singing a different tone, away from what the committee is likely going to do, because what he is doing now, he is trying to preempt the committee. That is, the committee is not likely to meet up with the 200,000 naira that he initially said is going to be the minimum wage, and now he's raising it up to about 1 million naira. So maybe it's a mind game that he's playing, but be as it may, we expect the committee to do a lot of considerations and ensure that there is no politics in this issue, because it's a matter of national interest. It's a matter of common concern. So there is the need for the sitting governors, the ministers, and all other stakeholders to ensure that it is free of politics, because it is going to outlive them. We are talking about so transactions here and there tend to be more robust when salaries are paid. So it is not about a few number of people who are workers. It is about the dependents that they have. No civil servant in Nigeria that does not have a dependent. So it's either you have children, you have wives, you have extended families who depend on your salaries to also move on with their lives. So I believe that the minimum wage is going to be something of common concern. The worker is only there to receive the salary on behalf of others. Because when you are there as a civil servant, you are receiving the salary on behalf of your dependents. You are receiving the salary on behalf of your children, on behalf of your wife, on behalf of your extended family. And then you are also receiving the salary on behalf of other individuals who are doing small-scale businesses, because they depend heavily on you. When you are not being paid, of course you cannot patronize them. And even when you go and take things on credit, it is when you are paid that you also pay them. So you realize that the minimum wage is going to affect everybody when you look